So tell me about McCartney 2. I remember that album. I bought it when it came out.
Well, that, of course, it was a great thing when it came out. But before that, I got a call from a friend of mine who was a fixer, a musical contractor in American language. And he said to me, "Hey, Rich, how do you fancy working with Paul McCartney?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like that. That'd be great." He said, because he's got this selection of tracks which he's never finished. And it's called Cold Cuts right now because it was all tracks which were never finished. So they were cold. Right. So they're cold cuts. So I said, yeah, nice name. So he said he's looking for somebody to work with to produce the tracks and arrange them and get whatever is necessary to get them done. He said, okay, well, the McCartney organization is going to send you his latest album, and then I've set a meeting for you at MPL at a certain time. And so I thought, oh, this is terrific, marvelous. And I had already met Ringo Starr when I was 16 in my bedroom, because my parents went to a party upstairs from our flat in Chelsea, and they brought Ringo down because they said, "Hey, Rich, there's somebody you'd like to meet." And of course, they brought Ringo Starr into my bedroom, which was really embarrassing. I can't tell you how embarrassing.
Did you have any Beatles posters on the wall?
I had a Beatles poster on the wall. Well, I was just mortified. But anyway, so this was my other Beatle who I met. And I went to the MPL offices, and they'd given me his latest album, which was Pressed to Play. He said, "Oh, hi, Rich. Nice to meet you. I really loved what you..." Apparently, he asked for me because of Slave to the Rhythm. And he'd been working with Trevor Horn and said, "Hey, what about that guy who you used on Slave? This is some great arrangements on it." So, "Oh, yeah, he's great. Use him. So thank you, Trevor. He said, "What do you think of my new album?" And I said, "Well," I said, "it's not a typical McCartney album. You're writing with a lot of different writers, and it seemed like you were experimenting, really. And, some of the experimentation works and some doesn't." At that point, it clicked into my mind, I've just kind of dissed McCartney at my first meeting. That wasn't really the most diplomatic thing to say. But luckily he said, "Oh, I'm really glad you said that," because that's exactly what it was. I missed writing with John so much. I had a special thing that we would write together. Even if he just said, "No, that word is crap," or "Get rid of that verse," or "Get rid of that line," or "I've got another idea for it," it was still enough that I felt I respected the person I was talking to. It was just so comfortable sitting with two guitars and writing things that we enjoyed. So he said I was trying to do that with these different writers. I think he had Elvis Costello and...
Their song, of course, is fantastic.
Well, it was fantastic.
Yeah.
The track Blue Sway was included in this list of tracks that he had never finished.
Right.
And this was one of them. And for that track, I decided that what it really needed, because it was an interesting kind of little groove, but I wanted to give it some richness. And so I got a string orchestra in there, and I got a harp, as I usually do. And then I also got Dick Morrissey to play sax over it, because it was a groove thing. And I knew he would play very little, but what was there was just going to be perfect, because he was such a melodic guy. And so that's how that track came about. And what was amazing about doing that track was the fact that I went kind of bonkers, apeshit, crazy driller killer on the track. And I was expecting from everything I had been told about McCartney, oh, you got to really be careful because he wants to be very controlling and he wants every note to be his. And, you're going to have trouble because... And it was just the opposite. I went completely bonkers, and he said, "Great, man, yeah, terrific, yeah, that's," and he left it all, everything that I'd written. Now, a lot of people who I've written for, they take out half of it because it's just going too far for them.
Sure.
Which is, that's their prerogative. They're the producers, and they don't have to have any taste. Oh, sorry. But in McCartney's case, he loved it, and he saw exactly what I saw in the track, and I had turned it in. And so because of that...
just sorry to interrupt you, that doesn't surprise me, though, because, that's what the Beatles were all about, experimentation and doing crazy things.
I got to tell you, that's what I said to everybody.
Yeah.
But people who had worked with him, lots of people who had worked with him, and I won't mention any names, had said, man, you're going to have trouble
I
because
think people self-impose those things. As soon as you let people be creative, that's when you get great music.
I think the overview is that no matter what anybody says to you, you can't trust any of it. You have to trust your own judgment and your own experience and your own creative feelings, because nobody is going to react the way you react, and everybody sees things from their own point of view, and that's great. But I found throughout the 16 tracks that I did with McCartney, I found every single one of them. It was, yeah, great, let's do that. Oh, that's nice, let's do that. So there was never any of that. And I could also see from working with him over a period of 6 or 8 months on these tracks, exactly how he was in a musical situation with other musicians. He was wanting to direct things to go in the way that he wanted them to go. But if anybody came up with an idea, I had Peter Vitesi playing some keyboards on one of the tracks, and Pete is one of the most creative guys on earth, and he was going pretty bonkers, and McCartney loved it. So, you know, that you can't tell. You can only see what you see. And as you know, as a creative person and in a producer in the studios and working with so many different talents and different brains, you can't control all of them, so don't. See what happens when they all, you know, you put these things into the pot, you mix them up and see what happens.
Right.
When Trevor called me to do the Frankie Goes to Hollywood track, Liverpool, you got to remember, I got a lot of work with Trevor because Ann Dudley was sick.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty much true. That's how the very first time I worked with Trevor, well, the first time I worked with him, he was playing bass for me on a commercial session,
Right.
which was great. But also then he was working with Ann, of course, all the time, but Ann was sick and couldn't do an ABC track for their first album. And so it was called Date Stamp, and I did it. And that was fun, and that was great. But then he called me for Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and of course Ann had done all their other records, but I don't know what she was doing on this one, why she didn't do it, but for some reason that was it. So Liverpool, that album, and the track was called Watching the Wildlife. And I loved the groove of it, you know, it was a shuffle, rock shuffle thing. And what I had written was a selection of triplets hitting that groove. So tickata, 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 tickata. But it was a massively hip line in triplets, high up, all pizzicato. It was just too hard to play. And they were great, and they made a very good attempt at it. So then Steve Lipson is sitting there, and he says, oh, yeah, I'll just shove it all in the synclav. So that's what I think it was either the synclav or the Fairlight. Anyway, what he did was we had this string players play the first pizzicato note. So they played each note of the triplets. And because I wanted the effect of the first violins and the second violin, you know, I wanted that stereo thing. Oh, we can do that much better this way. So we recorded I don't know if you can hear it on the record. It would be interesting to go back and listen. But it sounded that way in the studio. So you had it was going all over the place. And it was a great effect. But that's how it was executed. And it was the only thing I've ever done with strings or any other instruments where it was sampled and then manifested.
So it's a combination, either Ann was sick or he wanted something absolutely nuts.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I was actually hired for myself, I think, when we did the Pet Shop Boys. That was the first really major thing that we did. Left to My Own Devices, I believe was it. Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Huge song.
And I also, obviously, he did hire me deliberately for Slave to the Rhythm. So all of those things put together, we eventually had a relationship. And he would hire Ann when he wanted something that was slightly more classical, slightly more legit, you know, the Debussy thing, the whatever. And he would hire me when he would want something that was slightly more jazzy, funky thing. So
fantastic.
It was fun.
You know, growing up in the UK, things move really quickly. I mean, I was talking about this the other day, between like 76 and like 85. I mean, how many genres, how many huge shifts? You've got The Damned coming out with a punk record. Then you've got, only 2 years later, we're into post-punk.
Yes.
And then you've got like new wave, new romantics, while ska is going on at the same time. This is all in 3 years.
Ska was a big thing,
Yeah, it was just absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
And every band was experimenting. Like Queen would put out an album in 1980, The Game, and it's a disco song, a rock song, a 50s, everybody was just pushing the boundaries and trying out different ideas.
And also they didn't mind if they were in something like ska or whatever. I mean, people wanted to kind of cross-fertilize, so that was great.
What a wonderful time for music. It's still my favorite period. To me, it was a combination of the factors. The Beatles was recent enough, so people still cared about writing big songs.
Yes.
The production, the technology was coming up, so you had SSLs and great 2-inch tape machines. You had the beginnings of sequencing and sampling, and everything was just all at once happening.
That's right.
Incredible time.
And the economy was such that people were willing to pay for music. I remember the first thing that Cat Stevens ever told me about production, my very first major gig, he said, all you need to make great records is time and money. Because, and he said, it's really that simple. If you've got enough time that you don't have to settle for anything other than what's perfect, if you have enough money to hire the very best musicians and the best studios, you really can't go wrong.
There's one other thing you need as well.
What's that?
Taste.
Oh, well, yeah, you do need that, although some people have seemed to have gotten away with making very good records that are tasteless.
Right.
So,
because they had other people around them that did have good taste.
Sadly, taste is a matter of taste.
Yes, very true. So let's get a Swing Out Sister.
Okay.
How did that happen?
I got a phone call from Paul O'Duffy, who was working at a studio in Chiswick, where I used to live. And Swing Out Sister were a new signing to Phonogram. And they didn't really understand what they were doing musically, but they liked it. And they liked the look of the group. Corin was a fashion designer. And because of that, she had incredible clothes.
I never knew that.
Oh, yes. She's a trained fashion designer.
And they had a really unique look that made sense with the music.
Yes, they did. Yeah. The stripy T-shirts that had a kind of French, the berets, all of that stuff. And they loved the image of it. She had already thought about the image of the band, which is, a lot of bands don't necessarily do that. So I went in and Paul said, here's the track. I need some brass on it. And I listened to it and I loved it immediately. And I took one look at Andy. Every time he had played a chord that was a substitute dominant chord, I immediately knew that this guy was a jazz guy. And so that was a big connection right away. So I said, okay, I know exactly what to do with this. I'm going to kill it with the brass, but I also want to put strings on it. He said, we can't afford strings. And I said, well, can you afford one keyboard player doing the strings? He said, yeah, sure. So I wrote it as if it was a string section. And I got the guy from a group called Sad Cafe. Do you know?
Of course I remember Sad Cafe.
Man, they were a great band.
Yeah, they were.
A great band. And their keyboard player was a lovely guy called Vic. I got him to come in because I knew he could read really well. And I knew that he had the CS80. Now, in those days, I hated synth strings. I didn't really like the Selena or any of those terrible things. But he made a sound on the CS80, which wasn't good, but it didn't make me barf. That's all I can tell you.
Can we use that as a quote? Wasn't good, but didn't make me barf.
That's right. And he really took a lot of time over it, and I loved that instrument, unless you had to carry it. The CS80 is probably the heaviest keyboard ever made in the history of mankind, and unnecessarily so. But anyway, there it is. So we did the brass and the strings. And of course, that ended up that there was a relationship where the first record was so exciting that they put it out and it was a hit. And of course, it was a worldwide, pretty much #1.
Right.
And because of that, when we continued to do the rest of the album, they let me use real strings, which I really enjoyed, because for those songs...
No, Breakout was the first hit.
Breakout was the first hit. Yeah. And then I did Fooled by a Smile and Surrender, and there's the other...
So we're talking about genres at the time. I remember it vividly.
Yes.
That was another genre that was fitting in, because
Absolutely.
It was a jazz-influenced kind of pop music.
Yeah, they had lots of names for that genre. Yeah. They called it, pop lounge music, or they had all kinds of funny names for it. But it was a combination of that sort of Burt Bacharach and funk. You put those together. They had some nice grooves, and it was all good. And of course, her voice. I described in my liner notes to the album, because I wrote the liner notes, which was a verse poem, kind of a bebop kind of poem to the record. I described her voice as an alto flute, which is kind of the timbre of her sound. And everybody loved it, and I loved it, and it was perfect. And I'm so glad to see that they're still touring today.
Fantastic.
And my good friend John Thurkel is still playing trumpet for them, who played the lead on...
Wonderful.
Paul O'Duffy and I had worked together on Curiosity Killed the Cat, which was a great song called Ordinary Day, and we'd done some things. And so he called me and said, you did some nice brass on that, and you need to do some nice brass on this. And
fantastic.
The problem with the song, if we can call it a problem, is that it had gaps. 4-bar gaps where there was nothing except the band playing, and there was a funky little bass line that was cool, but there was nothing there. And I also noticed about the song Breakout, which I don't know what you think about it, but it's a wonderful song, but it doesn't have a traditional hook, because the word breakout is the hook. The whole chorus is break out, but before that you get don't stop to ask, and it goes, but that's not a typical commercial hook. So I thought it needs something catchy. And then I noticed that whenever she said break out, there was this 4 bars of nothing. So that's where I did well, of course, that made it work really well. And
has that been sampled for rap and stuff like that? For hip-hop things?
It's been sampled a lot.
I was just thinking myself, how huge
I noticed there's transcriptions of the brass arrangement up there. Not mine, but somebody else has done it. I got a call from the guys in Heaven 17, and they were doing a record with Jimmy Ruffin, the great Jimmy Ruffin. And he was the great Jimmy Ruffin. And what surprised me about it, knowing Heaven 17 and all the stuff that they'd done, I was expecting the manifestation of the song to be more electronic or more modern or something. But thank goodness they did this track very classically. And so it sounded like a soul track, a Motown track, or maybe even a Philly track, like a Philly ballad. But it was great, and they asked me to do some strings on it, and I did my thing, and it turned out so beautifully, and Jimmy Ruffin sang it great. And I think the only interesting thing that I can tell you about doing that track is that everybody was so nice. The guys in Heaven 17 were nice. It was no hassle at all. Everything was beautiful. The music was beautiful. The performances. It's pretty much lacking in drama. I'm sorry to say, but I really enjoyed that little record, and I loved the way that it came out.
So you did a lot of Pet Shop Boys.
Yeah,
a lot.
The greatest thing about the Pet Shop Boys is that Neil Tennant is a very intellectual guy. He absolutely thinks everything through.
Right.
Talking to Neil Tennant, it's really like talking to a very, very nice Oxford Don. He's very relaxed, very nice. He knows he's thought everything. Well, I want to do this, and I want. You know where you are with him. And he's super knowledgeable about the arts in general. And so that comes into the music. And he knew in a very calculated way that there was this Euro gay disco thing that underpinned the music. The drum machine, programmed drums, and the repetitive monotone bass line. And then But he said, what goes on top of that, once you have that, and you can go anywhere. You can go classical, you can go rock, you can go jazz, you can do anything as long as you've got that thing that those guys can get out on the dance floor from. And of course, his lyrics are superb because he's a writer. You know, he was a writer for NME.
I just love how he would have this track like you're describing, you know, and then suddenly this melody would just come in that everybody could sing along with. Not afraid to write a big pop chorus.
That's right. Not at all. And in fact, he and Chris wrote many great pop choruses. And also they made some great choices like Go West. When they did Go West, I thought, what fun. The Pet Shop Boys doing Go West, it's kind of a no-brainer, you know. So when we did that, he wanted pretty much everything. Again, for some reason, and I don't remember what the reason was, they couldn't afford real strings on that record. And I don't know why. He said, I'd love to have strings, but I don't have the budget. So I had to do the same thing. I had to find somebody, not Vic, but somebody to come in and manifest the string parts. And they were a little better. I still despise fake strings, we weren't in the world where we have samples now. Mm-hmm. We weren't in that world where they were real string samples. They were synthesized approximations. But anyway, I did the whole string thing with that, and I'm very sorry that we had to do that because it would have been really great. But anyway, I did real brass, and that was good fun. And of course, it was a nice version. But the fun part about that record was the choir. So
beautiful.
The choir, he said, okay, what I want a bunch of butch guys from Broadway. And so I said, okay, that's great. And he said, I'd like them going Go West. You know, I said, fine, great. So then he said, where are we going to find guys who can sound like that? And I said, Broadway. He said, okay. So somehow they had the money to fly me and my contractor, Graham Perkins. We flew to New York. Graham had booked 16 male singers from the Broadway stage. And he insisted that they had to be stage guys.
The real guys.
Because he wanted that sound. And it was just the most fun session in history. It was just hysterically funny. Then, when we came back to England, the song was very successful, and they had to do it at the Brit Awards. So they said, what are we going to do? So I said, well, you don't have quite that tradition here of that, but what you do have the tradition of is the Welsh mining choirs.
Oh, well, of course.
We got onto that, and we booked 2, not 1. 150 guys is one Welsh mining choir. We booked 300 guys. And if you look at the video, the decision was made that they had the miners there, all dressed in straight kind of jacket, tie, whatever, but they all had to wear yellow. We got yellow mining hats for everybody with the light on it. And I was conducting in the front with my yellow mining hat and a brocade jacket that I wear for such occasions. Chris and Neil were wearing white kind of strange outfits with the helmets. And what happened was, interestingly, the sound people couldn't accommodate 300 guys on stage singing. They said, to hell with that, we can't possibly do that, and we can't mic them up, and it'll just sound terrible. So we went to a studio and recorded these 300 guys.
Amazing. Which studio?
I believe it was West Side.
West Side. It was a huge live room.
Yeah, it was a huge room. Yeah. And so they recorded and then they used it in sync with the guys singing live. Or, well, actually, they had some of their voices on it, too. But anyway, that's what you hear if you look at the Brit Awards. They were singing, of course, live on stage, but it wasn't recorded, and what you're listening to is the pre-record. But it was great miming.
Yeah, I imagine for a live show, that would be a nightmare to try
and it was fantastic.
Mic 300 people.
And it was a fun thing. RuPaul was on the gig, and he just loved the whole thing.
Incredible.
And Kylie was there. It was really a fun time.
two big bands I'd love to talk about, fans of both, of course, the Depeche Mode and Tears for Fears.
Right. It was a surprising thing because they're a very electronic kind of band and more rocky, and I was happy to be doing it because I actually liked their tracks a lot. But when I got there with my arrangement, I wasn't... First of all, they were all there, which is very rare. And in fact, the producer, whoever the producer was, I don't know who it was, but he wasn't there. It was just me and the band. And it was at Abbey Road. And,
beautiful.
And I believe it's Studio 2 where the control room's upstairs and you walk down the stairs into the main room, which is huge. Maybe it was Studio 1. Anyway, there I was, and I had a lovely string section, somewhat dwarfed by the room. I really didn't know what they would think of it. But actually, what was so nice about it was just that they were asking me lots of questions, like how did you do that, and how do they when they do that thing, and what's that thing called, tremolo? What's all the what are all those because I write a lot of effects, of course, and this wasn't a dance track or anything. So I didn't go bonkers with lots of 30-second notes or anything. It was beautiful sort of voicings, and they said, "Oh, how did you get the?" And so the fact that they were so interested and so into it and the process, and they said, "Oh, we've loved this, and thank you so much, and we must do this again." And I never saw them again, but nevertheless, good luck to them.
Amazing. So, what about Tears for Fears?
Well, there we have another story entirely. I got a call from Roland Orzabal to come down to the studio, and they had already recorded this album and rejected it, and now they were producing it themselves. I think they had some creative differences with their producer and had decided, no, we're not going to do this. And so they were doing it with their engineer, who I've conveniently forgotten the name of, but that was it, and they were producing it themselves. And so they had this track called Sowing the Seeds of Love. And there was another track that I did called Advice for the Young at Heart, and that was very straightforward, a very pretty, nicely done song, and I just did some beautiful voicings, and it was all good. But this track, Sowing the Seeds of Love, they said, "We got to play you this." And so they played me what they had, and I said, "Wow, this is, a really well-done Beatles pastiche."
Yes, a masterpiece.
And so they said, we would like you to do everything on it. And I said, "Well, just as a matter of interest, why didn't you call George Martin?" And they said, "Well, because we wanted George Martin on acid, so we called you." So I said, "Well, thank you. I'll take that as a compliment." And the other interesting thing was, of course, I wrote all the Beatles stuff in it, and it's all there somewhere. But they did this thing which, of course, we were then very heavily into the digital age now. Of course, with the beginnings of what Trevor Horn had done with expanding the sonic possibilities of digital. By this time, they were very into it. And so they were able to take things that I had written for letter A and use them in letter D. And they took stuff that I had written for the chorus and used them in the verses. There was quite a bit of that going on. And which
creative license.
Creative license or creative licentiousness. But in any case, they had fun, and they did. I mean, I think it sounds fantastic. I think it sounds great.
It's a masterpiece.
They asked for the Beatles stuff, so I got Guy Barker to do. I had written this kind of piccolo trumpet thing to echo the Penny Lane sound, and he did that beautifully, of course. And it was just a really fun thing because I got to do all the Beatles stuff and get paid for it. You can't beat that.
No, absolutely.
No.
There's everything about that song, I agree, a Beatles pastiche, but a really great song as well. Many people steal the spirit of songs, but can't compete on the songwriting.
Very true, and I don't think the song has anything whatever to do with the Beatles or trying to copy them. And I love the lyric, and they or he writes some great lyrics in general.
Absolutely.
And by the way, I really think I've heard some stuff of the Tears for Fears live. They're doing another tour and their new album. That's great.
Incredible.
Really good stuff. And I'm so glad they got back together. Because at the time, by the way, also, when we were doing that record, they were not, shall we say, a duo. They were not communicating in a necessarily cordial manner. I'm glad that now they've even talked about it in interviews, which is quite fascinating, that they decided, hey, let's put all that behind us. We're both talented guys, and we've got something to offer each other, so let's try it. And it's great. It's really good.
No, the combination of the two of them, especially Kurt's voice.
I love Kurt's voice.
Even though Roland was the main songwriter, it's all of the parts that make it.
Yeah,
all great bands of that.
That's right. And their voices are different, so you don't get that too. I mean, with the Beatles, their voices were different, but they blended so perfectly together. Whereas with Kurt and Roland, I think they took the lead. And there was an individual sound that each one of them had. Kurt had this smooth thing going on, which was very good for tracks like, a lot of the tracks. So,
yeah, I mean, he sung a lot of the huge pop hits they had. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. When I listen to Kurt, it sounds so English to me. Like he has an Englishness to him, which I think in that period in the 80s was a big deal because it jumped out on American radio as being different.
And I love that. And I love that. And I love it when people have other foreign accents in English. A lot of people, I only mind it as a producer. I've had to produce a lot of non-English speakers doing songs, but it's only when it's not understandable that you have to modify it. I produced the singer Celia Nergard, who's Norwegian, and her English was superb. But once in a while, there would be a little word that I just had to tweak because nobody would get it. But I think that gives it personality.
No, it's a good point. I have this discussion a lot recently. Now, if you go to chart hits all over the place, there's so many more accents available, which I think is fantastic because, the immediacy and the access of music now is ridiculous compared to what we grew up with. So you're looking for things that just sound different, sound interesting. And I actually like accents.
Yes. Well, personality is everything.
I think to me, when I think of you doing all of these pop stuff, like the pure pop stuff, and boy band in particular, was, we put that pretty high in pure pop because you're known for coming at it in a more angular, like you've used the phrase like going nuts and stuff like. It's cool because I can imagine a pop producer doesn't want to go down the road of everything being so syrupy and insipid.
Oh no,
that it because I always talk about this. It's easy to do extremes, isn't it? You could go off and write a 7-minute insane 5-key change, 67 tempo change thing, and you can write a 6/4-1/5 pop song.
Yes.
The beauty is when you can bring those two things together, and you can just get the art and the pop to match, and that's the worldwide smash.
That's right. And I've always felt that with pop music, because some people think of me as being a jazz bow. I'm not just a jazz bow, and I've loved pop. I mean, I was so lucky to grow up in London during the 60s and go out to see all of these bands. I really loved that. And so when I heard records that had orchestral stuff on them, and I'm certainly not only interested in orchestral overdubs, but it's what you get called for.
Sure.
It's what I got called for. People would say, oh, he can write for strings. I'll get this guy. And then they'd think, oh, we're getting somebody else for brass because you obviously can't write for brass. Well, they don't think that way, So for me, it's all a matter of thinking as the band. What's the song about? What does the song need? When I heard things like Spanish Harlem, I heard those strings on Spanish Harlem, man, I thought that's what strings should do. They should come out and have a reason for being there and then get out of the way so that I can hear the rest of the song. And that's exactly what they do. So those kinds of records influenced me a lot. And so I've always tried to bring that attitude, that sensibility to doing whatever work I do, because I want it to be exciting. Because pop records are not jazz records and they're not middle of the road records. They're pop records. They have to jump out of the speakers.
Yeah. Well, also what I love about your work is you don't rely on any one technique.
No.
I was thinking the other day, I was listening to Marvin Gaye's version of Yesterday, and there's a section where it goes to the orchestra, and you can tell it's like really, just pushed up on fader. Right. Like suddenly they're like, oh, the orchestra comes in, and not all, because that's I'm not trying to diminish what it does, but it just focuses on the melody. But it really reinforces the melody. It's just right, huge, and yet there's tons of Motown which ignores the melody. That's the point. Is like there's no one way to do something.
Well, it's what we were talking about.
Speaks to longevity of career, of course, that you can.
Yes, earlier we were talking about the idea that music is nostalgia for music.
Sure.
And so when Berry Gordy decided to form his label, he didn't want to just sell to the 10% of America that was the black audience. Mm-hmm. He wanted to sell that music to everyone else. So he's very, again, calculated. He had a calculated attitude to add elements that would appeal across the board to all audiences. And one of those elements, of course, is the sound of an orchestra. The sound of an orchestra triggers something in all of us, no matter who we are. Anybody who's been to a movie, anybody who's heard any kind of music that uses orchestral classical music, it triggers it immediately. So he didn't want it just to be a bunch of guys, the Funk Brothers, playing in a room. He got people from the Detroit Symphony to come in and nail it. And he needed arrangers who could do that. And that's part of what my book, The Invisible Artist, is about. So Berry Gordy wanted everybody to feel the trigger of orchestral music, to feel the weight of what he was doing. He didn't want it just to be a bunch of guys in a room. He wanted it to be something that said, hey, this is something of importance. This is something that has validity. And so that nostalgic thing that orchestral sounds do is why I got called for so many years, 40 years of phone calls. And why not? And it worked very well because you knew what to do with it. And there were other people doing my kind of work, very few actually, but I really liked the fact that Ann Dudley didn't do what I did, and John Altman did something slightly different. He came at it from a more jazz kind of attitude. And that was what was so cool about it. People would hire you to do different things, and it worked out very well.
What are you currently working on?
Currently, I'm working on my new album, which I'm really, really excited about.
Wonderful.
It's called Niles Smiles, which is the name of my company, and of course, something that Miles Davis can't sue me for.
I was about to say, yeah, but a nice nod.
I've been doing for years and years, I've been doing my big band thing called Bandzilla. And I've done a lot of records with that, and I've done a lot of performances with that. But it's a very heavy thing to carry around 20 people.
Sure.
So this thing is an octet. It's 3 horns, trumpet, saxophone, and trombone.
Incredible. And
a killing rhythm section. Mark Egan from the Pat Metheny Group on bass. Ian Palmer on drums. Fantastic, wonderful guy. Alex, who you can't see, is off camera, is playing keyboards on the record.
Is Ian related to Carl?
Very much so. That's his uncle.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So Ian comes from a very
drum famous family.
Yes. Yeah. And I think his other uncle, Steve. And it's a lot of people that are drum oriented, and man, can he play. And the great thing about him, again, is taste. He understands all the technical stuff, but he uses it when it's necessary. And he's very much a guy who plays the composition rather than the drums. And that's a big thing for musicians to do.
When I was a kid, it was like the really schooled musicians, kind of got in the way, to be honest. And there's been this sort of new batch of schooled musicians, this sort of Gen Z kind of, which I really, really love, because they're going back and listening. So you have like the Snarky Puppies and the Ghost Notes and stuff like that.
Right.
These guys are all, they've all got, they've all listened to Watermelon Man. They've all listened to, all of that stuff from the 70s. But they've got a twist on it where they don't just rely on tricks, which I'm really, really enjoying.
Absolutely. And you have the opposite, which I don't enjoy. You know, you do have a lot of people that are just chops.
Yeah, but that's all we used to have.
Yeah.
You remember there was just that period of like, somebody would say, you got to hire my friend, he's so amazing. And he comes in and overplays on everything.
Yeah, but you don't want so amazing. You want to play the song.
Exactly.
You want something that's going to be compatible. And I write some pretty hairy stuff.
Sure.
No one has ever accused me of writing easy music to play. But at the same time, I also am writing, I'm very serious about the compositions. I'm very serious about writing a composition that has form. Every section has a reason for being there.
Yep.
And I want musicians who can understand that and play the composition. And, you know, I've got John Thirkell playing lead trumpet. You can't have anybody better than that.
All right, I've got a question which is just popping up into my mind. Now, with brass players, unless they're classically trained only, but most brass players are obviously jazz enthusiasts, so they're used to improvising. Mm-hmm. And you can probably see where I'm going. How do you find working with classical players that are used to more, you know, maybe they've learned by heart great pieces to perform with orchestras, but 99% of their life is just reading?
All right. I'm so glad you asked me that, because it is a nightmare for me.
Right.
Let me give you an example. I used to have a superb string section in London that played on, I mean, I've worked with them for 20 or 30 years. Gavin Wright was the leader of the string section. He had his own section, and he trained every single one of the string players. He had them come in and play to a click. And if they couldn't play to a click, they were not getting hired. So he had people, it was the first string section I played with where, man, if I was writing something that was solid 16th notes, you know, for 16 bars, they were on it. And they could play it. And when they had to play something like ding, 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 da, dang, bop, it didn't rush. Mm-hmm. How wonderful. Yeah. And so I then did a wonderful concert with Michael McDonald at the Mermaid Theatre in London for the BBC, where I was the musical director. There's so many arrangements to do. I had Lawrence Cottle, the great bass player and great arranger, do half of the arrangements for me because I couldn't possibly get it all done in time. And we had the BBC Concert Orchestra strings. I had my own brass section, which was fantastic, wonderful people, my own people, and I had my own rhythm section, but I had to use the BBC Concert Orchestra strings. And I kept having to say to them, you know, you're behind. Can you just, you know, just everything's behind. So finally I went up to them and I very nicely said, I'd like to introduce you to Ian Thomas. He's a very fine drummer. And he's the guy you have to follow. So what he's playing, that is your metronome. I'm sure you've all played to metronomes, you know, and one of the players who was particularly snarky in the bad way said, well, you know, we're classical musicians. We phrase the music. We don't just play it like machines. And I said, well, no.
Phrase it in time.
Phrase it in time, because there is your time. Yeah. You have to play it in time. And it was a nightmare for me. And it's always been a nightmare for me when I have to play. I conducted
and you didn't write it in rubato. You actually have a drummer there.
Exactly. And I had an experience once where I recorded with the LSO, and I didn't enjoy it one little bit. There's an old saying in England, it was like dragging the Queen Mary through a sea of Mars bars. It was just a terrible experience because of the time thing. That's my worst experience with classical musicians. I had so many great experiences working with Gavin Wright and his string section. And the people in the section used to say to me, you know, your sessions are the only sessions where we practice the night before.
Fantastic.
Because they said, we know we're in for some notes. We know that there is going to be, if I may say, fly shit on the page, and we're going to have to read that. So we get our eyes, focused for that experience. Because
wonderful.
Most people, they said, write whole notes. They write pads and simple chords and stuff, whereas you write lines. And I always think about string sections, and you can hear it on a lot of my records. You can hear it on Blue Sway for Paul McCartney. I think of the string section as a rock guitar player. That's the way I think about them. And they've got to be ready to whip it out. And they had to understand the sliding thing, and a lot of the grace notes and all the things that make it bluesy. And it just sounds so great when they do it. And a lot of the stuff I did for the Pet Shop Boys.
We will link to that below.
Yeah,
definitely.
Great, yeah.
So when does your solo album come out? Have you got a release date for it?
I don't have a release date. I'm still in the mixing stage.
Okay.
In fact, I'm going to finish recording the trombones on next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And so hopefully then that'll be ready to mix. And we've got the first track mixed already, and it sounds fabulous. And look out for Niles Smiles.
Niles Smiles. We will put a link to all of Richard's stuff below. So links to the songs we talked about, links to his website, links to the book, links to everything.
Thank you for linking me so nicely.
Thank you ever so much.
Hey, man.
I really appreciate it. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios, tschüss, auf Wiedersehen, adio.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, sayonara.